Binoculars. We are finally here at the more practical real-world segment, and for those of you who may not understand what I'm talking about, there were two introductory videos which I very strongly recommend to watch. The first one introduces instruments like this one, camera lens, riflescope, spottingscope, and so on, and then we cover topics such as optical principles, terms, terminology, light, the human eye, their interaction, and so on and so forth. And the second video talks about the industry, for the most part the optics industry, but not only. We talk about terms, conditions, the marketing, manufacturing, what manufacturers and marketers call what, and what terms are absolutes, what are buzzwords, and so on. And now we are going to talk about each instrument individually. So, like we said in the introduction, the binocular is fully stereoscopic. It has two telescopes, one for each eye, and is fully portable. Again, under normal circumstances, of course, there are exceptions. And that's what makes a binocular, well, a binocular, and that's what differentiates it from its other peers, such as camera lenses, which projects an image not on the human eye, but on a large, flat, and inert surface, which is very different from the tiny biological and curved surface of the human eye. It's also a main component of a system, not a complete system, because you still need the camera body itself. A riflescope, which is professionally known as a gun sight telescope, is primarily an aiming device, and also it is only an accessory. So in other words, that system of the firearm, the ammunition, and the shooter is a complete and closed system. When you add a telescope, you extend, and you greatly extend usually, the capability of a system, but nonetheless that is only an accessory, and also it has a reticle inside, an aiming reference. So that's what makes it unique among other optical instruments. A telescope for astronomy, unlike the others, is defined not so much by its shape and technology, but by the subject. It's made exclusively to look at the night sky and celestial objects, stars, moon, deep sky objects, and so on. And there are, of course, different technologies, different kinds of astronomical telescopes. Microscopes don't really belong here, but for the sake of comparison and better understanding, I do cover them a little bit. Not individually, but what we used to maybe think of as a common telescope to look at very small objects, such as a blood cell or any kind of living cell, and even smaller structures, molecules, today even maybe atoms. That used to be a compound microscope, a two-dimensional, shows a flat image. And a little bit closer to our topic is the stereo microscope. Again, both of them are species in the process of going extinct, because today microscopy became so incredibly advanced that nobody uses really compound microscopes, maybe for demonstration or some high school small project. As far as the stereo microscope, that's a completely different animal. They may look similar, but they're completely different. A lot of people think of a stereo microscope as of a reverse binocular, a binocular for short distance, which is in a way true, and that is typically reserved for professional use. Some very specific professions. A lot of people who deal with antiques and historical objects have to check the authenticity. People who collect coins, people who check diamonds, diamond cutters, they may look at it. So you want to look at an object not on the molecular or on the cell structure level, but just something very small, and you need the three-dimensional aspects. So that's what you would use a stereo microscope for. And last but not least, a spottingscope, very popular with with hunters, with target shooters, long distance precision shooters. It can also be used for astronomy, and very often is a spottingscope can be thought of or or considered a hybrid between an astronomy telescope and a binocular. So it's relatively small and mobile, not as much as a binocular. You typically almost always must have a tripod to stabilize it. It's heavier and larger than a normal binocular, but on the other hand, it's much more powerful. So it's easier to observe, let's just say, game herds at very long distances, miles away, to know which way to go and things of that nature. Astronomy, backyard astronomy. So this much for introduction of binocular compared to its peers. The 10 commandments of binoculars. Number 1, always, 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 and I repeat, always, always use a strap. Never ever use a strap. If you need, use it without a strap if you need to hear it from a negative perspective. This one is actually a harness. I'm going to touch up on it later on. Number 2, don't scratch or otherwise damage the lenses. It sounds simple. In practice, it is not as simple as you would expect. Some of the biggest enemies of lenses, or to be more precise, the lens coatings, are oils, any kind of oil, any kind of grease, including the natural grease that's found on your fingertips. It's always there. Even the second you step out of the shower, it is a little bit greasy. Morale of the story, keep your fingers away from the lenses, from any lenses, all lenses, especially the eye lenses. If the eye lenses get damaged, that's really, really bad news. And in the same vein, keep any kind of abrasives, even fine grains of sand. Anything that's larger and harder than a normal grain of dust should be kept away, and it should not be rubbed into the lens or lens coating, because like this you damage the lens. You brush it off. There are soft brushes that are typically sold with any kind of cleaning kit, and many binoculars are already supplied with that. Okay. Number 3, always hold it at the farthest extremity away from you, so closer to the objectives as much as possible, and create as much contact between your body, meaning the palm of your hand, and the body of the instrument as possible. This will provide the most constant, consistent, and most stable hold. Okay, I like to say sometimes, maybe not nice, but grab it like a porn star. And last but not least, when it is in storage, just lay it flat like this on the table. Not, I don't want to demonstrate the wrong thing, but a lot of people stand them on top of the objectives. That's wrong. It's prone to fall, and it's just a disaster waiting to happen. Put it like this, and if possible, put in something like a closet, a china closet. It's also good, and we will come back a little bit towards the end regarding care and maintenance. So before we even go into it, what is a binocular? Well, a binocular is simply a double telescope. And of course, the big advantage, like I mentioned before, is that you can view through it extremely, extremely naturally. No eye strain. You don't need to close or make abstraction of one eye, and it is fully portable. So one of the other big benefits is that binoculars typically provide a fully stereoscopic view. We will go into this, but first let's go into the more simpler part of this equation, which is binocular vision. Most mammals have 2 eyes, or probably all, and we create 2 different images and superimpose them, and then we have the biological, psychological, neurological capability of combining them into a single image that we can decipher, and we can find our ways in the world that surrounds us. A step beyond that is stereoscopic view. So in other words, we don't just think, we don't just feel, but we actually see in 3 dimensions. So we can have a feeling of what happens on the Z coordinate, right? So this is the X, the up and down, the vertical, the horizontal, the left and right is the Y coordinate, and the Z coordinate is the one that goes from me to you, from me away, and we can actually see this. Most of us, about more than 90% of the population have this capability. Some people have a condition in which they do not actually see in 3D, but even they can get cues and understand by perspective, by relative size of objects to one another, what is where. How and who uses a binocular? A binocular has many uses. I would say primarily still it is made for hunting, but not only. Until about 2010 or so, close to 70% of binoculars imported to the States were explicitly imported for the hunting market. Again, of course, different levels, but as you can see, close to scratching 70% of a market share is huge. So that was the primary market. In 2010, the internet was becoming sort of a main source of information, and birding started to take off. Until the internet times, there were not many birders. They were considered kind of weirdos, and it wasn't really a known hobby. But about that time it started to grow, and a few times it was labeled the fastest growing hobby in the United States. So since then it has gained a very big market share, and of course the first tool of any birder is a binocular. But of course, beyond hunters and birders, binoculars have marine uses. So almost anyone who has a yacht or a boat has or should have a binocular. So do geologists, so do forestry people. A lot of state park and other agencies use binocular for observation of forest fires, for example, things of that nature. Linemen, a lot of line maintenance companies would use binoculars to check the lines and so on. The general structure of a binocular, and I'll make it a little closer for you to see, is of course the first thing you see is the housing. And a good quality binocular should have a one-piece housing, and in the past and even today cheap binoculars are made with multiple parts, and the two telescopes are held together by an arrangement of bridge and hinge. So the hinge is actually what pivots here, makes them pivot, and the bridge is what connects them together. In the past, people like to make a big deal about the bridge. This is a different kind of binocular, and there was talk about open bridge and closed bridge. Today it's not as popular anymore, and in reality the customer does not really have a lot of control over this, because a binocular comes either as a closed or an open bridge. That's number one, so you can't have the same exact binocular from the same brand and so on with a choice of open or closed bridge. So it's not very relevant. But what used to be termed closed bridge had kind of a beefier area here, and that sometimes it got in the way of the fingers. And the open bridge used to have one part of the two bridge arms going to the hinge at closer to the eyepieces, and then one out far next to the objectives, like this. And they were considered higher end, a little bit dainty, a little bit more sensitive. Today we don't speak about that, because the tendency is more and more towards binoculars like this, so to have the bridge just surround the focusing mechanism and a smaller hinge, and they are sturdy enough and good enough, and they're also very comfortable. So for those who are purchasing binoculars from this point on, that is not so relevant anymore. Okay, when considering a binocular, you really have to look at three things: quality, quality, and quality. The optical quality, the mechanical quality, and the structural quality. Of course, the optical qualities goes without saying, or at least should go without saying. You want a very high quality image without distortions, with color fidelity, sharpness. The mechanical quality pertains mostly to the focusing mechanism, of course the hinge, which is super important, and in some aspects the eye cups. And the structural quality, of course, is the build quality, how well it is made. And there are quite a few considerations with this. One of them, of course, is the strength and resilience of the binocular. By nature, binoculars and all optical systems are very, very delicate and sensitive systems. And yet we use them for things like hunting that can be sometimes arduous, and camping, hiking, so on and so forth. On boating, things can fall. So it's important to preserve and to keep the binocular as much as possible from falls and bangs and nicks and dings and so on. But again, life is life and life happens. And so in the past couple decades, practically all binoculars already come rubber coated. So over the housing there is a rubber protection, and that's for more comfortable holding, but also to prevent a little bit, or to minimize the effect of shock in case of a fall. There is another structural benefit that came in the past couple decades, and that is waterproofing. Today, although you should never assume anything, but the vast majority of binoculars, at least those that are not junk, good quality binoculars, came fully waterproof. And there used to be a term, it's still being used to some extent, fog-proof. Fog-proof is understood to be a level above waterproofing, so a more robust, more proficient, more efficient waterproofing. In other words, the instrument is completely sealed, and inside of it, it is not just filled with air, but with a dry gas, such as argon typically, or nitrogen. And what the benefit of that is that when the binocular is taken from extreme temperature changes, from very hot to very cold, or vice versa, there is no condensation inside. In the past, when binoculars were filled with air, if you went out from the warm car or truck and stepped out in winter, when typically hunting season is, the binocular was fogging up inside, and then it would take a good chunk of time. It could take sometimes hours for that condensation to subside. So today, the vast majority of binoculars already come fog-proofed, and of course waterproof is to prevent the entry of water into the instrument from rain or falling in a puddle or a pond or things of that nature. Of course, it should be taken with the proper care. It still doesn't mean that binoculars can be submerged at randomly in water. So when not necessary, don't do it. But it should be said that most modern binoculars are okay to rinse under the tap. So if you went in some activity that mudded the instrument and you want to remove the mud, or any kind of other event that made it dirty, it's okay to rinse it off under cold tap water. That's fine. Again, make sure that the binocular is indeed waterproof. Okay, the hinge and bridge, we already spoke enough about it. I will only mention something, actually not. I will leave it for later, but as you can see, the label where the brand used to be here, really just as a hinge protector, reveals a threaded a threaded hole where you can screw something in, and that is for an adapter so that you can attach the binocular to a tripod, and I will demonstrate it later on. Bridge designs are not really relevant anymore, as we said, and now we can proceed on to the optical system. The optical system is, of course, the heart and soul of any binocular. And like most such simple optical systems, it consists of an objective, a prism system, an image correction system, and the eyepieces. This is the general overall description of the optical system. Of course, optical systems quality should never be compromised. That should go without saying. And the objective, we typically in diagrams always represent the light coming in from the left and going out, creating the image on the right. Again, that's probably because that's the way that we read, and it's a little bit easier to imagine it, so I'll try to stick to that convention as much as possible. I'm not really sure how it's going to come out in the video, but at any rate, the job of the objective system is to create a primary image. So simply to form an image of what we are looking at. We're looking at a certain object, it creates a primary image, and in the process, that image will be inverted and reverted. So in other words, flipped, and that is because when the light goes through a lens, so we can use this as an example, the rays are converging. Again, we assume, as is usually the case, that the objective system is based on convergent and not divergent lenses. In camera lenses, we do have in some elements divergent lenses, but anyway, we're going to use convergent lenses. So they converge the light rays at a certain point, and from that point on they flip over. So you can see how the image comes like this, and of course it's three-dimensional, so it does this and this. So we see an upside down image. In astronomical telescopes we don't need to do that because we're looking at the deep sky, at the night sky, I'm sorry. It could be the deep sky, it could be other things, could be planets, so we don't really care if the image is upside down and flipped. But on terrestrial observation products and instruments, we do need to have an image correction system. And in binoculars, 99.9% of the time, this is done by way of prisms. There is also sometimes, in emergency cases or for whatever reason, typically military binoculars in war times are done with mirrors instead of prisms, but the mirror does the same thing as the prism. It just flips and corrects the image, turns it right side up. The simplest imaginable prism system is a poro prism. It comes with pyramids or triangles, and it hits the internal surface of the prism on 2 points. Each time it is turned 90 degrees, as you can see in the diagram. And so it reverts and corrects the image. The problem with that system, or maybe not the problem, but one of the disadvantages, is that the prism have to be big and heavy. So what it causes is that if a binocular has poro prisms, as you can see this versus this, it is much less streamlined. The objectives are typically in normal sized binoculars. In mini or pocket binoculars it's the opposite, but the idea is that it's offset. As you can see, the eye lenses, the eyepieces are close to one another, and the objectives are far from one another. So that is one of the disadvantages. This is mostly cosmetic. It does not take up more time because these are typically more squat. So if you put them together, these binoculars are the same size. As you can see, one is not really bigger, larger than the other. So that's kind of a moot point. However, it prevents the housing to be a fully one piece. So this can be done in one piece, but as you can see from a manufacturing standpoint, this creates some problems, and the optical influence or result of these objectives being farther is to create a more three-dimensional image. So the stereo image is accentuated here. You have a much better feel to what's behind what and distances. Typically, not typically, I'm sorry, optically, the binocular only magnifies on the X and Y coordinates. So it stretches the image this way, but not this way. As you can imagine, if it would do this, it would be a distortion. If that actually happens, that is a problem. So what you get with a three-dimensional binocular is an image that's magnified, enlarged on the X and Y coordinate, but on the Z coordinate it's not. So it creates a little bit of a problem. You don't normally see it, or you see it, but it doesn't disturb, it doesn't become unpleasant or weird, or it doesn't give you like a feeling that something's wrong up to about 10x. So the two factors in how three-dimensional, how much it accentuates the Z coordinate, the distance between objects, between you and the subject is the distance between the objectives, which is called the stereo base, and the magnification. So something like this is pretty extreme, but at 8x it's still more than tolerable. So you don't really feel it, and it's even pleasant. Some people like this more than the flattened image that we typically see with these inline prisms. It should be said that even inline binoculars like this one, I'll tell you a little bit later why, create a little bit of a more stereo effect, and this is very good. It's an excellent binocular. So that's so much for the Poro prism. Should I even go into it? I'll mention it in passing that in the past there used to be a lot of talk, a lot of discussion about prisms made out of a certain glass component, a certain kind of glass, and I go into more detail in that in the second introduction. I'm talking about glass types and glass standards and things of that nature. So people used to say that Poro prisms made out of BK7 glass are not as good as those made of BAK4 glass. These are both standards that are taken from the shot catalog. It doesn't matter. It's simply not true, or not really true. BK7 and BAK4 have nothing to do with quality. They're just different types of glass, just like you can have different kinds of bread. You cannot say that French bread is inherently better or worse than Italian bread. Given quality for quality, they are just different. Now, of course, if you take let's just say a French bread from a high-end expensive bakery and an Italian bread from a crappy bakery, then of course it's not a fair comparison. You can't say that French bread is inherently better than Italian bread. If you buy them both from the same bakery, then you can appreciate the difference between them. So same thing goes for BK7 and BAK4. Simply a lot of manufacturers who made cheap binoculars opted to make the prisms from BK7, yes, because that glass is a little bit cheaper. So if you buy in quantity, it makes a difference. But also it's a little bit easier to manufacture. They used to cut the prisms to smaller size, and so under certain conditions, when you look through the binocular, you could see a little bit kind of an angular edge or a border to the image. But that's it. So anyway, today it's not really relevant because 90+% of all binoculars are Schmidt prisms anyway. So this has inline prisms. They have two prisms with a funny shape that makes that the light goes in and comes out in on the same linear path, on the same line. Good. And it goes through the prism, it touches the prism 5 times. And when this technology was nascent, not really nascent, but when it started seeing wider use in binoculars, there was a problem. It didn't create an image that was as nice and sharp as the image that came from binoculars with Poro prism. The reason being is that the light is being split. The light beam, let's just say, was being split and then recombined. And then in the late 80s, 89 or 88, something like that, someone invented a coating on one of the faces, on the face that split the beam, and reconstructed them to recombine the light properly. And so that imperfection, or that not really a defect, but that imperfection in the representation of the image of the light was fixed, and today they all have that coatings, and those coatings are high quality. The industry learned how to apply these coatings, and it doesn't really add a lot of cost to the binocular. Why? Because the entire industry is geared towards that, and they're already making these prisms in large quantities, and they're applying the coatings and so on and so forth. So today you typically, on a serious purchase of a binocular, you typically don't really consider Poro prisms. Of course, there are some exceptions. Marine binoculars very often still tend to be 750 Poros. Why? Because it's been going on for many years now, and it's good to use like that, and the normal use of that binocular is good enough or doesn't demand so much an inline construction. In a perfect world, pretty much all marine binoculars would be attached on a pier. They not always are, but yeah. And then at a certain point, another coating was introduced in 2006 or 7. It's called a dielectric mirror coating, which further improves the performance of dark prisms, roof prisms, right? The professional term for a roof prism is dark prism. The poro prism has totally internal reflection. So in other words, the entire light beam continues its path as it is without changing the light itself, only the image attitude. And so it doesn't need any of those coatings, not the dielectric mirror and not the phase correction coating. And as you can see here, this is how an image is being created. The light comes in, it goes through. This is a dark prism. I flipped the image because I wanted to follow that convention of light coming in from the left and going out on the right. And as you can see, well, this representation is actually not all that accurate, but it's good enough for our purposes. So you can see that on the surfaces where the light changes for the first time, for the second time, and then when it goes out, there is a phase coating layer, maybe a couple layers. So this much for prisms. There are some other prism systems, but they are not all that common. But I will mention one variant. Actually, here you can see a couple. There is the Abe prism, which is it is a roof prism. It's a dark prism, but it's a little bit less compact than the normal Schmidt prism. Here we see an improvement on the poro prism. Again, to make it one piece, it just doesn't have enough benefit to justify its existence, so it's practically never been used. The Abe prism, however, has some benefits. So although it's big, it is not as big as a poro prism, but it's bigger than a normal Schmidt Dach roof prism. But it has the benefit of not requiring the dielectric mirror coating, and it also allows typically to engineer the binocular with the objectives a little bit further out from them. So even in a roof inline binocular, you can get a fairly good sense of the stereo surroundings, so a fairly stereoscopic image. Not as accentuated as in a poro binocular, but like I said, you don't really need that. So if it's present in a small quantity, in a small amount, that's more than good enough. So you get a beautiful, truly stereo, truly three-dimensional image without making it too excessive. Let's talk about collimation. Again, these terms are getting not actually moot, but practically moot, because the industry is becoming so good, and the quality of the products, especially of the better products, I don't really want to put a dollar amount on it, but I think that if you're looking at a binocular in the $500 range, $500-600 and on, it's practically immaterial, or almost. Again, things can happen. The binocular can fall, sustain a shock, or just some problem in manufacturing. But today we don't hear that much about collimation, but it's still good to know what it is. Collimation means that the two images are always perfectly superimposed at all IPD openings. IPD is the inner pupillary distance, and it's the distance between the eyes. So as you can see, when you fold the binocular at the extreme, this doesn't work for too many people. And when you fold it to the extreme, that also doesn't work for too many people. The vast majority of people use it somewhere toward the middle. Of course, there are slight variations, and the tiny variations make a difference. But collimation means that the two images are always perfectly superimposed, and that's kind of an optical somersault or feat or accomplishment, which is fairly difficult. So therefore, at least in the past, the binoculars were not truly collimated. They were conditionally aligned, if you will. So in other words, they worked well towards the middle, but if you needed to use them out, so if you're a very big guy or for whatever reason the eyes are more distant from one another than the norm, you didn't get a perfect alignment. And same thing towards the very middle. Children or very petite people would have a problem with it. So it's important to have a good and perfect, or maybe near perfect collimation, and you certainly should expect it with a higher end binocular. Let's go back again to the concept of focusing, which is of course very closely related, or almost inherently related to image formation. If we want to form an image that is at least of acceptable quality, that we can recognize what it is, where it is, what the shape and the color and so on, we need to put it in focus. What does that mean? An image can be formed when the rays of light are parallel, and that typically happens at infinity. Infinity again is a distance from which, or beyond which, everything is already in the same focus. But if we look closer than infinity, if I look right in front of me, so a human close focus is somewhere like 10 or 11 inches from the face, and from that distance out to infinity, you always have to refocus your eyes depending on what distance you look. So how do we do that? How, when the rays of light coming from an object that is not at infinity, closer than infinity, are not parallel, what do we do? Well, we manipulate the system, we cheat, so to speak. With your naked eye, it's an involuntary muscle. It just compresses the lens of the front of the eye, and so the prescription, the bending power of the lens changes. The light coming from a point that is not at infinity, that's close. I'm looking now at the phone, right? So I'm focusing my eyes close, and I'm so to speak cheating the system. I'm making the eye think or perceive the light as if it were actually parallel. And again, I expound on this much more in the first video, so I recommend to watch it. At any event, the same thing happens in a simple optical system, just mechanically. The optical system, when the focus mechanism is at rest, or at the end of its travel, then it looks at infinity. It's not exactly like this. I'm kind of simplifying this, so I'm not purposely lying to you. But I will explain a little bit in more detail. So when we are looking at infinity, we can create a normal image. Again, what happens when we're looking at closer than infinity? We need to change the system. We change the focal length, and then it creates the image of something that is closer than infinity. So there is a flower pot over there. It's whatever, 10 yards maybe away from me. Obviously it's not infinity, so I want to manipulate the system. I'm moving a lens inside of the binocular, and that changes the focal length of the system. It creates the image of something that's at whatever that distance is, let's just say 10 yards. Now of course, everything that is closer than 10 yards and farther out of 10 yards, it's not going to create a proper image. So everything will, beyond that distance and close to that distance, will be blurry. But from that object's perspective, we are at infinity, or we treat it as infinity, and then we can create an image of it. Then of course the image goes to the prism system, like we said, corrects the attitude, and it sends it to the eyepiece, and the eyepiece magnifies the image. The job of the eyepiece is magnifying the image. Okay, let's talk a little bit, before we talk about the eyepieces, about focus mechanism. Today, this is the most common focus mechanism. It is a center focus. Okay, but this is only from a mechanical perspective. From an optical perspective, we can modify the focal length by moving one component of the objective, or by changing the distance between the objective and the eye lenses. So how does this work? Now let's start with this one. This is a more primitive, let's say primitive, let's say simpler system. And you can see that now I am all the way at infinity. This is the closest distance. There is a little tolerance, and yeah, okay, I can see the mountains there. And now if I want to come closer, look what happens. The distance changes. So the eyepieces are creating an image. Let's just say that we're looking at like a long road, or we can see a lot of different distances between from the observer to the target. So we're looking like a hillside or a long winding road, and you can see that only one part of the road is sharp, and of course what's beyond and what's further out is blurry. So as you move this, you are focusing on a different image created by the objective system. So this is a very, very simple system, and manipulates the distance between the magnifying glass or the eyepiece and the optical system. This one moves the last element, which is here right before the prism, in the objective system. In the past, there used to be binoculars that actually moved the outer element of the objective system. You don't see those too much today, but 40 years ago it was easier to manufacture a center focus binocular that pushed these two. Good. So that's that much for focusing system. There is also another focusing system that again you don't see a lot today, and it's called individual focusing. It means that you need to focus each eye individually. Like I said, a lot of marine binoculars are still sold as Poro 750s because it's been the norm for so long, and it works, so it just doesn't worth messing with that. And of course, you ask yourself, well, why sell a binocular with individual focusing when you can sell it with center focus? It looks like the system is relatively inexpensive, so it doesn't really increase the price. Why? The answer is it simply is not worth messing with, and with binoculars of that nature you don't need to focus a lot. Typically out at sea, the binocular will 80, maybe even 90% of the time will be focused at infinity most of the time. And there is another trick, since I already mentioned it, I'll talk about it. There is something that's called a hyperfocal. Hyperfocal is not as set in stone, let's just say, as infinity focus. Infinity also varies. It varies from one individual to another. It varies a little bit depending on the conditions, and different systems can be built with reaching infinity at different distances. So maybe one binocular reaches infinity at, let's just say, 300 yards, and the other one at 400 or 200 yards. So there is a relatively wide range of variations. But anyway, the hyperfocal means, and this is why it's slightly arbitrary, a little bit before infinity. So let's just throw out a wild example. Let's just say that your binocular is built to reach infinity focus at 300 yards from you, okay, or 400, whatever it is. Let's just say 300. So you look at objects that are close to you, 10, 20, 30, whatever feet or yard from you, and you can focus on them. When you get to almost 300, to almost infinity, that would be your hyperfocal. That means that anything from that point on, a little bit closer than that point, out to infinity, will be an acceptable focus. Not a perfect focus, but an acceptable focus. So let's just say that your depth of focus, and I'm going to talk to you, that is somewhere around 20 yards. So you focus it at a little bit beyond, closer than 300. So let's just say 290, and then you add the extra 20 yards. So anything from 270 yards out to infinity will be in focus. And again, depending on your tolerance, how you define or what is acceptable to you, you can manipulate this. Again, it's not something super important. Photographers of the past used to use it when they wanted to photograph something unexpected and fast. So they were expecting some sort of wildlife, and you don't really know when it appears. Then they would use this method. But again, with modern fully digitalized cameras, it's not really necessary. This burst and this autofocus and things of that nature. So it's not really relevant, but just so you know, you understand the concept of of hyperfocal. So that much for focus. Today, the vast majority of binoculars are sold with a center focus that focuses the last element of the objective, and this works very well and is perfect. Before we move on, I want to mention that because the discrepancy between the two eyes, so all of our eyes are not focused exactly at the same point, and there is a little bit of a dioptric difference. So even if your vision is 20/20, it has nothing to do with it. There might be a little bit of a discrepancy between two eyes. We do have a mechanism that moves only one of the focusing elements, and I will come back on exactly how to do that when we talk about setting up the binocular. But now I want to mention a little bit focus depth, or depth of focus, or depth of field. It simply means that there is a certain amount of the scene in front of us that can be in focus. So when I focus my binocular, let's just say at 20 yards from me, or 30 yards, the depth of field is not just exactly at 30 yard and being paper thin, but there is a little bit of a depth of the scene itself. So one binocular can show you anything from 20 to, let's just say, 40 yards in perfect focus, or very close to perfect focus, and another one only from 25 to 35. What does it depend on? A lot, many different things: the focal length, the construction of the binocular, but mostly the focal ratio, which is, we don't talk about it a lot in binoculars, but in film, in camera lenses, this is a pretty heavy topic. So the opening of the aperture and its relation to the focal length, let's call it the aperture. So it depends a lot on the aperture and the magnification. So a 10x binocular will have a shallower field than an 8x. So the higher the magnification, the more shallow the field, and the wider the aperture, again, the more shallow the field will be. And you can see some examples here. As you can see, the perfect focus of in this photograph is the flower in the middle. As you can see, there are a couple of blades of grass closer to us that are blurry, and of course the background, which is far, is very blurry, and also the little blades of grass that are slightly behind that flower are also blurry. And again, here's another example. Forget the text there, that's not two types, they're just two settings, or two different quantities, if you will. So on the image on the left hand side, you can see that there's a deep depth of field. All the scene, the entire scene, is in good focus, whereas on the right hand side, only the subject is kind of isolated. They made the depth of field or the to be very shallow. So that's what it is. Let's talk about real field of view and apparent field of view. That's a big deal, especially with birders and hunters, people who are viewing and scanning the scene. The real field of view is the actual slice of the scene that you can see with the binocular. So as you can imagine, as soon as you pick up the binocular to your eye, you lose the vast majority of the scene. We typically consider people's field of vision to be about 70 by 140. Of course, this is not concrete, and it depends from one individual to another, but that's an accepted rate, or an accepted measurement. Again, it's approximate, so it's not super precise. And like I said, there are variances from one individual to another. Be it as it may, as soon as you use an instrument such as a binocular, you reduce that by a lot. And the field of view can be expressed in either angular way, which is the more scientific or more precise way, but the more practical way is how much of the scene can you see at a given distance. So it's typically a number of feet at 1,000 yards, 358 or 360 or 370 feet out at a distance of 1,000 feet. So that is the actual scene, what you see. So you see a way narrower scene. But now when you look through the instrument, it appears to you that you are 10 times closer, let's just say, on a 10x system, or 8 times closer in an 8x magnification. So when you look through it, of course, the physical boundaries of the object are blotting out a lot of the scene. But once you're up, you imagine that you are close, and of course your mind is concentrating on the image, not on the black edges. So what is visible for you, and the best way to imagine this is to pretend that you actually were there, that you actually were 8 or 10 times closer to the object. How would that feel? And that's the apparent field of view, the imaginary field of view. And of course that also helps, and it's also important, even though it's not a concrete and actual measurement of a physical measurement, but it appears to be, if we make abstraction of the magnification, it appears to be X amount. It could be 50 or 52 or 55 degrees, and so on and so forth. So the bigger the apparent field of view, of course, the better it is, because you feel like you're seeing more scenes, and of course the viewing comfort is much better. But the real measurement that one should concentrate on is is the actual angle of view. And we typically, as consumers, we want everything. We want the image quality to be super high. We want the focusing mechanism to be perfect. We want the eyepieces to be very good and comfortable, and we want a wide field of view. But from an engineering perspective, it's almost impossible. You can't satisfy all requirements at all times. You have to give something up. So one of the things that you're giving up is cutting out a lot of the scenes. So depending on the the magnification and some other attributes of the system, that will limit the angle of view. So even a high quality binocular will not offer you a tremendous amount more. Half a percentage point, sometimes a full percentage point over a cheaper system is usually what you can normally expect. When we talk about magnification, we should think about it properly. Very often people are concentrating a lot on magnification. How much times does it magnify? Of course it is important. Of course magnification helps you resolve the image, but on the actual scale of importance, it's not on the top. So you should always think about quality and comfort first, and give up a couple points of magnification if it makes sense. So in other words, if you have a good system and you want to shell out a certain amount of money, it makes much more sense to buy that versus another system for the same amount of money, where you lose quality but you increase the magnification. And in modern real world, it does not really make that much of a difference. So once you set a certain budget and a certain size, so the objective size, which is way more influential, or way more important, if you will, than the magnification, then a similar instrument with less or more magnification is not going to make a big difference in price. Actually, sometimes they're even the same price, and today the differences between similar sizes is also shrinking in discrepancy, in difference of prices, and I'll touch on that later on. I hope to remember. Hey Bert, how you doing? The exit pupil. Exit pupil is the actual beam of light that comes out of the binocular, and that is also, in the past, was to some extent a point of contention between optics and binocular users. In general terms, it holds true, it is true that a bigger exit pupil is better than a smaller one. Why is it? Our pupil is able to see the light that comes in. The light is being flooded over, so imagine that your pupil, let's just say like this, in bright sunlight is 2 or 2.5 millimeters, and then you use a binocular with an exit pupil of 3 or 4 millimeters. Well, a lot of people will tell you that it's wasted light, which, if you look at it in absolute classroom academic terms, yeah, it's true. But in reality, the binocular moves. You're not made of stone, you're breathing, you're moving, so you definitely want to go over the size of your pupil. and it's a little bit more accentuated or more important in astronomy. Astronomy typically, not typically, is almost always invariably done at night when your pupil is dilated. And an adult's pupil can be dilated 5-6 millimeters, maybe a youngster's even 7. So you definitely want to cover that and give a little bit more with the exit pupil. So morale of the story, a larger exit pupil is typically easier and more convenient to view through, even though there is some so-called wasted light. But anyway, you can see the slide and it's kind of self-explanatory. So exit pupil in common popular literature is denoted as EP. In professional literature it's XP. So again, use quality over size as usual. Eye relief, like we said before, and like many other things that we said before, today is less of a big deal than it used to be in the past. The one thing that is important to remember, that eye relief is typically given as a distance, when in reality it is a range, so there is some tolerance in there. Eye relief, of course, is a way bigger deal with riflescopes, when you do have to be far from the scope so that it shouldn't hit your eyebrow from the recoil. But in binoculars also, depending on how you use the binocular and whether you wear glasses or not, or just your level of comfort is somewhat affected by the eye relief. So today it's very common to have binoculars with eye reliefs of 12 millimeters and more. 15, 16 is even way better, and with modern eye cups this makes it even less relevant, because the eye cup, contrary to popular belief, they don't regulate the exit pupil or the eye relief. I'm sorry, the exit pupil distance, that's the professional term. Exit pupil is something else, but the exit pupil distance is the distance at which you can comfortably view the image that is created by the eyepieces. And I have to mention here, I should have spoken about it when I was talking about the eyepieces, but the eyepiece, the image that the eyepiece is forming, is a virtual image. Again, that term is explained in the first video, but it's an image that cannot be further projected or manipulated. It's like the image of a mirror. So you look at yourself in the mirror and it appears that you're on the other side of the mirror. There's nothing beyond there. So you cannot project that actual image that you perceive to be behind the mirror. You cannot project it somewhere else. So the the eyepiece is creating such a virtual image, and this is the very important factor, because this is something that manufacturers don't tell you. That image has to be projected, focused at infinity. Again, remember, now we're talking about the third image in the system. So the objective creates an image for the prism. The prism throws that image out on the other side, and then the eyepiece magnifies that image. That image has to be focused at infinity, regardless of where the subject is. Subject could be at close focus, at infinity, anywhere in between. But once you focus that image, the image that the eyepiece creates of you, which is the image of an image, has to be focused at infinity. In other words, when you pick up the binocular, you always have to relax your eyes completely, as if you were looking at infinity. So you're looking through the instrument, and you might be looking at something at 5 or 6 feet, whatever, which is typically the spec of the close focus on good quality modern binoculars, and it's irrelevant. Your eye has to be fully relaxed. This is one of the big benefits of such optical systems. So very, very important to remember. And again, like I said, in modern high quality binoculars, this is the way it actually is, or should be, but pay attention to that. So when you're testing binoculars for purchase, make sure that you don't have to strain your eyes at all. When you look through the eyepiece, your eye has to be relaxed, just like you're focusing at infinity. Another important principle is that not all people are equal. So just because a binocular worked for your buddy Johnny and he's similar to you, he's in the same age group and the same weight and so on and so forth, similar to you, it may work very well for him and may not work for you. pick up a different binocular. And as you can see, there is a representation there. Just like people are different, so too the structure of their eyes are different. So the face is different, right? Our faces are all different. The distances between the eye, the depth of the eye, the eyebrows, and even inside the biological, the shape of the eyeball itself, and the size, and so on and so forth. There are infinite amount of tiny little details that make differences. And by the way, I just took this picture as an example. So it has nothing to do with the genetic makeup or the origin of these people. You could pick any one of these pictures and replicate it as far as the attributes of the person. So you can take the one, let's just say, from the right hand side and in the middle, let's just say female, age of around 35, so let's just say give you the margin of 30 to 40, and X amount of weight, let's just say between 150 and 170 pounds, of Asian descent, and so on and so forth. So even if you define it that precisely and duplicate, make it all people like them, you will have the same amount or the same kinds of differences regarding the eyes. So each person would have to use a slightly different IPD, a certain slightly different setting with the eye cup, or perceiving the images differently. Again, the genetic makeup may add to the variance, but not a lot. So the variance is there regardless of that. That's not, the image was there just for an example. So just like we are different in our size, weight, age, physiognomy, yada yada yada, so too the eye itself and the way we see and use this instrument can be different. So just because it worked for one person, you cannot take it granted that it will work for you. So anyway, the idea is, the moral of the story is that you cannot satisfy all people all of the time with one instrument. The industry is going to what is called an average person, and those of you who remember in the past there was a big deal about custom stocks for rifle. Today we speak much less about it because there's so many different variants and adjustable stocks that it became quasi irrelevant. So from a practical perspective, choosing a binocular, like I said, you focus on three things mostly: quality, quantity, and quantity, optical quality, mechanical quality, and structural quality. Once you have a certain budget, you want to spend that money mostly on quality and not on gadgets and nonsense. Again, the binocular in and of itself is simple enough that and there's not much in terms of adding features like in, let's just say, automobiles or electronics, where one is more easily distracted. But again, the market is so flooded with product that you have to know what you're doing. You have to rely in some sense on the brand and its reputation and size and I mean age and so on. So what you first of all have to know what you will use the binocular for, right? So for specific uses, again, for the most part it will be hunting or birding, and a 842 like this is a very, very, I don't want to say universal, but very widespread kind of binocular. Hunters very often will go for the 10x because they want to resolve, they want to sex and age the game, of course, and that's easy. It's easier to do with a 10x, 10 times binocular, than an 8 times. Whereas birders very often will prefer a wider field. But again, once you found that bird and you want to observe and delight in its colors and the plumage, the feathers, then all of a sudden you're going to wish that you had a 10 times or a 12 times binocular, right? So you can't have everything at the same time. But 42 millimeter 10x is probably still the most common size of binocular for hunting. Now remember, as we increase the objective, which is the second number, right? In today's convention, it typically goes in 25 millimeter for a pocket or very compact binocular, then a 32 for a small mid-size, 42 for a full size, 50 for a large size. And if you go around and you hold it, you may want to consider going a step down, because modern 30-ish millimeter binoculars are catching up with the quantity of the 42 millimeter. So the bigger the objective, the more light it lets into the system. The more light gets into the system, the better the image quality. This is not just a question of size and quantity, for many reasons. Number one, because the incoming light, as we computate it, it goes in 2 dimensions. So the 32 to 42 is not just 10 millimeter, but you have to multiply the radius by pi, and so it's a bigger percentage that you would expect. So the 42 lets in a lot more light than a 32, but conversely, a modern 32 has such good quality that you not always need that extra light. But again, a lot of hunting is done at very low light conditions, so you have to balance these requirements. If you walk a lot and if you do a lot of arduous and difficult mountain hunting, you might be better served by a 32 millimeter binocular. But again, if you're going to use it in very bad light, even today that 42 millimeter binocular provides you more light than a 32 millimeter. And again, that's also explained in the first video. So more light creates a better image. It's not just it's a brighter image, but it's focusing more detail, or more, let's just say, points. It's not real points, but more quantities to form the image. So the image that's formed by a larger, again, given a certain quantity, obviously. So never ever go to a higher size with a lower quality. We're talking about compare apples to apples. So this manufacturer, this brand, this model, you know that it's high quality. Within that product line, you can compare between different sizes, but not in different quantities. So for military uses, hunting afoot, lightweight, or any kind of activity like that, and especially if you're going to be in bad weather, so a lot of rain and snow, then you want to go with a fully weatherproofed 10x42, or if you're more into birding, an 8x42. Wildlife observation, again, depending on what exactly the job is. If you need more field to catch the animals, to perceive the animals, then you go with a wider field, which is typically a lower magnification. If you need more detail, then higher magnification. For astronomy, you typically don't need waterproofing, because you're going to use it in your backyard when it doesn't rain. When it's raining, there are clouds, you cannot see the sky, and very often you will stabilize that binocular on a good sturdy tripod. And so then you don't really need waterproofing. Again, you're not going to walk around with it, so weight is not so much of a concern, and you can use a very large binocular, something like 50, 60, 70 millimeter objective that lets in a lot of light, because you want to see the stars and those planets nice and clear, and you want as steady a tripod and high tripod, so you can get under it, and hopefully without touching the binocular itself. And so we finally arrived to the stage where we can talk about practicality, setting up the binocular. Like I mentioned, the first of the 10 commandments, and luckily for us, there are only 4 of the 10 commandments with binocular, right? Always use a strap, hold it right, don't scratch the lenses, and put it down flat. So it's pretty simple. The only time that it's okay to use a binocular without a strap is when it's new in the box and you get it for the first time. You would the extremities of the strap come like this, so this kind of strap, and there are hoops here in the binocular body. This one employs such a system. This one is slightly different. It's difficult to see because the lens covers are also attached to the same attaching point, but here you go. This is the strap loop, the strap lug. You insert here the bare thread or strap, and you take it out of the other side, and there is a little plastic tab to lock this all in place. And one variant on the typical strap, which I very strongly recommend, is this kind of harness. It has a an area here that holds the whole harnesses, and you put this in. And again, of course, if you're going to have a backpack and a rifle and things like that, that definitely comes into consideration, but it stays like this, and this minimizes the weight. So this can make a 42mm binocular feel like a 32, or maybe kind of like a step down. So it distributes the weight, and it helps with bearing the weight of the instrument. So again, attach the strap, always keep the lenses on when you're not actively using the binocular. This is unfortunately easier said than done, because sometimes manufacturers come up with all kinds of funny ideas just to make their binoculars stand out and not necessarily to be practical. Some lens covers don't stay on properly. And protect it. Guys, for those of us who hunt outside and you want to protect the lenses when you need to respond to a certain call from Mother Nature, maybe fling the binocular on the other side, or at least use the lens covers, because a little bit of the urine can splash back from the tree or wherever you're doing, and it's not good for the lenses. That's one of the 10 commandments. So you need to protect it. You need to think about it a little bit less relevant for women. So setting up the binocular, again, what you want to do is we will make abstraction of the eye cups. I'm going to mention something regarding that, and we stretch and retract the binocular on the hinge a couple times until we find a sweet spot. Again, more experienced users already have it and do it kind of almost involuntarily. They just close the binocular to exactly the size that they want, make a fine adjustment, and it's almost like a non-conscious process. But in the beginning it can be annoying, and after some time of using the binocular you will find a sweet spot. Eye cups, like I mentioned before, some people are on the mistaken impression that eye cups set eye relief. They don't. Eye cups are simply pieces of plastic or rubberized plastic, and in most cases some better ones offer a metal mechanism which also has its own set of problems. But anyway, eye cups are simply for comfort mostly in holding the binocular, and it has some implications and repercussions. Today a binocular is very, very comfortable to hold. So you of course hold it out like here, as far on the objective as possible. You find your IPD, your inner pupillary distance, and for most people, or many people who don't wear glasses normally, you would extend the eye cups to the end or almost to the end, and you find an area of comfort. That means that at least in principle, the XPD, the exit pupil distance, the distance at which you can properly perceive and comfortably see the image, is also within the range of the eye cups. So first of all, modern binoculars extended the range. Let's just say that in the past you had a binocular with the 10mm XPD, exit pupil or eye relief. It was good from, let's just say, 9.5 to 10.5. It was pretty narrow. Today we stretch. So if I sell or buy a binocular that comes with a spec of 15 or 14 or 16mm, there is a little bit of extra. It typically means the outer edge. So 16mm would be the farthest, but it will be anywhere between 11 or 12 or something like that to 16. So there's a good range, and the eye cups make it very, very comfortable to hold the binocular. Now, how does this influence magnification, for example? When in the past, when we didn't have adjustable eye cups or just as little rubbers that would fold back, we would hold the binocular normally like this. You've seen Dirty Harry. This is how he also holds the binocular, and any movies about pirates and so on, they show you a little bit all the binoculars. This is how binoculars were held. And that means that hand tremor was a big deal, because you hold the binocular like this for the first couple of seconds, it's fine. But as time passes, the more and more fatigue setting into the arms, and that's why it's also important to try to hold the arms as close together as possible, so that you hold the binocular with bone rather than muscle. And whenever possible, whenever you have the opportunity to rest your elbow on something, whether it's a windowsill, car door, hood of a truck, limb of a tree, boulder, what have you, do so. But with the advent of adjustable eye cups, people stick the binocular into their eye socket, and that provides a tremendous amount of stability. And hence, since the introduction of adjustable eye cups, the tendency has been towards higher magnification. So a lot of people now hunt with 10x or even 12x binoculars. Why? Because it's easier to hold it steady. In the past, when you had to hold the binocular away from your face, that was a different story. It's more tremor went in, and of course the tremor is always magnified by the same ratio as the magnification itself. So in a 10x binocular, a tiny little tremor like this becomes 10 times bigger as it pertains to the image, and on a 12x 12 times, and so on and so forth. Okay, so we want a good eye relief distance, a good exit pupil distance, and adjustable eye cups, which today are almost taken for granted. All right, we just spoke about holding the binocular properly. For general use, of course, we said again, do not scratch the lenses. That's the first commandment. The second commandment, you always hold it with the strap. Don't scratch the lenses. Next up, you want to set the independent focus. And the center focusing binoculars that are popular today have a provision to adjust one of the telescopes independently, and that's called the independent focusing feature. Most people know it as a diopter or diopter adjustment. So what is this? But the purpose of that is because people have discrepancies between their eyes. Their eyes are not exactly focused at the same point, like it's been previously mentioned. And so, because these two tubes or focusing lenses move together, they cannot be glued, they cannot be always identical, because you have to synchronize it to your eyes. So there is a provision for that. And under normal circumstance, you use the center focusing system, but when you set it up for the first time, you want to make sure that each telescope is independently focused to each one of your eyes. How do you do this? You pick an object which is not an infinity, and maybe even stay away from the close focus, so something at 10, 15, 20 yards or so. Focus on it very sharply with the side that does not have the adjustment, okay? The side without the adjustment, which is typically the left-hand side. The adjustment is usually at the right. So you look with the right eye. If you want, you can close the you look with the left eye. If you want, you can close the right eye or cover it. It doesn't really matter. You look at your object and you move until it's tack sharp, the sharpest you could imagine. And here I got it. I'm looking at the chair, and now I open the right eye, and if it's perfect, it's perfect, but if not, you make small adjustments with just the right hand side adjustment, and from that point on they will move on together. This is mostly a set it and forget it preposition, and as you can imagine, this works most of the time, but when it doesn't, it's a big pain. The number one cause for this setting to move is lending your binocular to someone, right? And if you were a good student in school, you know that you should be a nice person, good person, and borrow things when people ask, but there are three things that you should not borrow under any circumstance, and they are your wife, your car, and your binocular. And if you have a precious rifle, I would also recommend against it, because things can and do happen, unfortunately. But if someone else touches it, chances are that they will adjust it for themselves, and this might not fit you. Other changes that can happen is age. With age, the eyes changes more drastic changes in weight, in blood sugar. So if someone becomes diabetic or healed from it, that might change it. But typically there's not much to mess with. So you set it, forget it, and once in a blue moon it needs an adjustment. Another point to ponder is whenever you compare binoculars, whether to buy a first-time binocular, a second-time binocular, a new binocular, whatever the case is, or you just want to compare with friends, you always want to minimize the details being compared. So you want to compare, let's just say, a 10x to an 8x. Well, try to choose a binocular that's as identical, as similar as possible. If you have access to another binocular that has the same objective size, comes from the same brand, the same product line, so brand X, product line Y, 10x42 versus 8x42, you want to gauge or evaluate the influence of the objective size, for example. Well, same thing. Go ahead and compare brand A, product line B, an 8x42 versus an 8x32, or 10x32 versus a 10x42, and so on and so forth. Another thing to keep in mind, that you want to evaluate the binocular under many different circumstances. So you want to do it on a sunny day, on a cloudy day, at bad light, at early in the dawn, or at dusk, things of that. As you can see, for the evaluation to be really valid and meaningful, it's kind of difficult. So you'd have to put in something, but it's not impossible. So if you have the time and the will to do it, one way to do it is to stick a page from a magazine somewhere on a wall or on a tree, and then set up the candidates for comparison, and then you can take notes. You can see which colors were reproduced better, which lines were you able to read from which binocular, right? These headlines, and then this subtitles, subheadlines, and then the paragraph itself. You can take notes at which distance which line became unreadable, which binocular was sharper, what helped you, and so on. So this is the way typically to evaluate not just binoculars, but all kinds of optics. When not in use, don't keep the binocular in an uninhabited place. So something like the garage or the basement, things like that, where there's no climate control, so that you don't subject it to a lot of changes and that the eye is dry. If you live in a dry area, it's not so relevant, but if you live in a humid area, it's very, very strongly recommended that the binocular should be somewhere where you live. So living room, dining room, bedroom, something like that, you know, where there is normal climate control, but it's never really too humid or too hot or extreme cold, even though they are made to be used under those conditions, but it's better not to constantly expose them. You may wonder why I haven't mentioned the numbers so much. And it's because numbers are important and numbers do have an influence. But with binoculars, a lot of the hype and the marketing is concentrating around the numbers. Besides for the fact that, again, I spoke about this a lot in the first video, but the second number, so binoculars are typically sold as 8x42 or 6x30 or 5x25 and so on and so forth. The second number, which is the more influential one, pertains to the diameter of the last element of the objective lens, okay? And this has a big influence on the size and weight of the instrument and the price, of course. So the price goes up with the size of the objective, right? A bigger objective will cost more. Again, there are other things that influence that. And the second number is the magnification. But again, numbers are numbers. Anyone, a piece of crap, the cheapest, worst binocular can be an 842, just like the highest end binocular. So really we need to gauge quality. That's what really matters. Of course, not to say that numbers are irrelevant. Like I said, even a difference between 42 and 32 can make a difference, and indeed does pose a dilemma. Like I said, you want to have the lightest and most mobile, most portable binocular, but you also want the highest optical quality. So it's a make or break. At a certain point, you will have, unless you can buy two binoculars for two different for different scenarios. But assuming that you want to have only one binocular, you have to make or break. And today the tendency, the 32 really picked up in the hunting world. So many hunters are opting for a 32 millimeter binocular because the savings in size and weight, especially in weight, offset the gains in quality of the 42 millimeter. But like I said, if you don't walk that much, so for example, if you hunt from a tree stand, which is very common on the East Coast and Louisiana, places like that, you're anyway not looking at long distances. It is true that it's not as true. It's an additional fact that you typically underneath the canopy, so it adds for the detraction from the light quality, the ambient light quality. In other words, it's darker. And again, you're stationary, so you might as well take a 10x50 or a 12x50, and it's fine because you're going to be standing in your tree stand, and when you hold the binocular, you will rest your arms on the ledge or the limb of a tree, so that's fine. So in that case, yeah, of course, maximize the incoming light. Again, always maximize quality. So spend as much as you can on the quality. But again, a 32 millimeter binocular is kind of, let's just say, at first sight, it doesn't look like much. But when you have to carry it for hours and hours on long hikes, then it can become very significant. So it's a relatively big difference. And same thing conversely in quality. What I was getting at, that in the past, the price gap between two identical binoculars, let's just say same brand, same product line, you had quite a gap between the price of the 32 and the 42, so that might have been a factor that tips the scale. Today, the difference in price is shrinking. It's getting less and less, and again, that has to do with logistics and production, manufacturing, availability, bookkeeping, accounting, things of that nature. So things that don't really pertain to the instrument itself, but again, the price that you pay for a bigger instrument or a bigger lens. Again, when something is bigger, it's typically there's more room for error, right? So it adds to the price. And conversely, when it goes below a certain size, producing miniature products has its own set of challenges. So that's typically how it goes. But in binoculars, typically the bigger the binocular, the higher the price. But again, the price gap, at least between the 32 and the 42, because they are the most common sizes, is going and shrinking, and the industry is kind of swinging back and forth. In the past, let's just say 20 years or so, maybe a little bit more, the convention used to be, until about 30 years ago, let's just say, that the convention were like round numbers, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 millimeter objectives. Then the industry slowly started to shift to 32, 42, and so on. The reasoning being that they were able to add significant optical quality at a lower price or cost, not necessarily in dollars. Quite the contrary, the cost was of production went down, but they were able to create a higher quality product without adding too much to the weight and the size of the product. That's what I'm getting at. And now, for some other reasons, now we kind of go the other way. We can produce a little lighter and smaller instrument with the same quality as the previous 42 or 32. So the industry is kind of slowly, I don't know if it's a shift, but there's definitely a tendency now to go back to the 40 and 30. Again, there is also the retro craze, right? A lot of people went back to film photography and vinyl records. So there is kind of that, right, the PT Cruiser kind of mentality. Maybe that also plays into it. So I hope, oh, here, I almost forgot. I told you that I would show you how to attach a binocular adapter. So if you want to stabilize and your circumstances call for it or allow for it, let's just say you're a hunting guide and you can leave your equipment somewhere or with someone, or you're not that mobile, you can drag a tripod with you, and you're doing a long period observations, it's a good idea to get a vertical binocular adapter. And this is the cheapest and simplest way of a binocular adapter. There's simply a screw, and then on the bottom there is a plate where you can put in a camera plate. I'm gonna touch on that topic soon. So as you can see, the threaded hole here matches the screw, and this is, by the way, a near universal standard. So practically all binoculars sold, and I'm only saying that because I don't want to say something that might be incorrect, but as far as I know, there is a single standard and they're all interchangeable. So you screw this in, and then you would screw the camera plate in the bottom of this adapter, and you put it on the tripod. Maybe I should have brought a tripod, but this is how it sits. So it sits on the tripod, and then you can view through the binocular without touching it, so there's no movement, and of course you're not straining your arms. It's a great benefit. A word on camera plates. I would expand on this when I make a video about tripods. The camera plate does not come with a binocular. I repeat, the camera plate does not come with a binocular. Neither does it come with a spotting scope. I cannot tell you how many phone calls I got from people, I lost the camera plate. It was in your spotting scope. I understand, because you attached it, you forgot about it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but you did not buy that with the optical instrument. The camera plate is a part of the tripod, just like your car, your wheel came with the car. You didn't buy the wheel from the tire dealer, right? From the tire place. You bought the wheel together with the car. Same thing with the tripod plate or camera plate. The professional term is camera plate. A lot of people call it tripod plate. And also, tripod plates are not universal. There is a tendency in the market not to make it a little bit more interchangeable. But when you buy a tripod, make sure to buy an extra, a spare, at least one camera plate. And also check what system it utilizes, because some systems are very widespread and commonly utilized, and some other systems are very unique and difficult to find, and if you lose it or it gets damaged or lost, then it's difficult to replace. So I think that I covered everything that I wanted to cover in this video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. I will put links to the first 2 videos also in the description or comment section, and also tell me what do you want next. I'm still on the fence between a camera lens and a riflescope. But until the next time, enjoy the great outdoors, enjoy great optics, and have a great, whatever it is where you're watching this, day, night, week, year. Take care.